Happy birthday to me." The words were a ghost in the room, barely a whisper, swallowed by the profound and heavy silence of the house. 72. A number that felt both impossibly large and strangely insignificant. The grandfather clock in the hall, a relic from my husband Richard's family, ticked with a cold, metronomic indifference. Each tick was a tiny hammer striking an anvil of emptiness. I sat at the head of the dining table, a table I had polished myself that afternoon until the dark wood reflected my tired face like a murky pond. It was set for 4. The good china, the one with the delicate blue flowers around the rim, was laid out perfectly. Silverware gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier. I'd even put out the crystal water goblets, the ones Chloe always said were too fussy but secretly loved to use when her friends were over. A pot roast, Ethan's favorite since he was a boy, sat cooling in the kitchen, its rich aroma now just a sad, lingering ghost of a celebration that never was. I had made a small chocolate cake, Leo's favorite, and placed it on the counter, a single, unlit candle waiting patiently in its center. They had promised. Ethan had called me 3 days ago, his voice full of that practiced, easy warmth he used when he wanted to sound like a good son. "Mom, we'll be there for your birthday, of course. A real family dinner. 6 o'clock sharp. Chloe's even excited about it." A lie. I knew it was a lie even then, but a part of me, a foolish, hopeful part, chose to believe him. Hope is a stubborn weed in a mother's heart. The clock began to chime. 6 o'clock. Each bong echoed through the silent rooms, a funeral toll for my expectations. I didn't move. I just listened, tracing the patterns on the porcelain plate in front of me with my finger. Maybe they were stuck in traffic. Maybe something came up at work for Ethan. Excuses began to form in my mind, flimsy shields against the truth I didn't want to face. I sat there for another hour, the silence growing louder, more accusatory. The pot roast was cold now. The house felt like a museum of my own disappointment. Finally, I pushed my chair back, the sound scraping harshly against the floor. I walked into the kitchen, the sight of the untouched cake a fresh pang of pain. That's when I saw it. My grandson Leo's phone, lying on the granite countertop next to the fruit bowl. He must have forgotten it in a hurry. The screen was dark, but as I reached for an apple, my movement must have triggered it. It lit up, displaying a notification from Instagram, a new story from Leo. My thumb trembled as I tapped the colorful circle, the screen filled with a scene so bright, so joyous, it felt like an assault. There they were. My son Ethan, his arm slung casually around his wife, Chloe. She was laughing, her head thrown back, a glass of champagne held high. My grandson Leo stood beside them, a forced smile on his face, his eyes not quite meeting the camera. They were on a yacht. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The deep blue sea stretched out to the horizon. They were all there, my entire family. A toast, frozen in time. And beneath the image, in a cheerful, looping font, were 2 words that hollowed me out completely. Family first. I stared at the image, my mind refusing to process the sheer, casual cruelty of it. I wasn't just forgotten, I was deliberately excluded. This wasn't a last-minute change of plans. This was a premeditated act of erasure. They had packed bags, driven to a marina, boarded a boat. They had planned this vacation, this perfect family moment, and the plan had never included me. I tapped on the screen again, and a video started playing. I could hear the wind, the faint sound of music, and Chloe's voice, shrill with manufactured excitement. "To us! To family! Getting away from it all!" she cheered, clinking her glass against Ethan's. He just grinned, that easy, charming grin that he used to get his way. The same grin he'd used on me just 3 days ago. I was it all. I was the thing they needed to get away from. My fingers went numb, and the phone slipped, clattering onto the counter. I didn't flinch. I just stood there, my reflection, a pale, ghostly figure, in the darkened kitchen window. The cake, the roast, the perfectly set table. They were props in a play where the main actress never got her cue. I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the edges of a family that had decided I no longer belonged. I wasn't in the picture. I wasn't family. Later, I don't know how much later, I found myself in my small room in the East Wing. It used to be a guest room, but they had moved me in here after Richard died, saying it was cozier and easier for me to manage. The truth was, it was out of the way, far from the main living areas where they entertained their friends. I hadn't bothered to turn on the main light. The only illumination came from the small green LED on the charging base plugged into the wall by my bed. It was for my medical alert bracelet, a cheap plastic device they'd insisted I wear after a dizzy spell a few months ago. "It's for your own good, Mom," Ethan had said, strapping it to my wrist himself. It felt more like a leash than a lifeline. The door creaked open without a knock. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Chloe had a way of entering a room as if she owned the very air inside it. She stood there for a moment, a silhouette against the brighter light of the hallway. I could see she was still in her vacation clothes, a linen dress that was probably expensive. She was tanned. "Oh, you're awake," she said, her voice dripping with a false, syrupy sweetness that was more insulting than any shout. "I was just doing a final sweep." She glided over to my bedside table, her movements smooth and deliberate. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the small green light. With a flick of her wrist, she leaned down and pulled the charger from the wall socket. The green light died, plunging that corner of the room into darkness. "Saves electricity, Mia," she said, dangling the plug from her fingers for a moment before dropping it onto the nightstand with a soft clatter. Her tone was light, casual, as if she were talking about the weather. But her eyes, when they finally met mine, were cold and hard as chips of ice. "Besides," she added, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips, "where are you going to go?" The question hung in the air, a final definitive statement of my imprisonment. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. I was trapped, not just in this room, but in this life they had constructed for me. I glanced towards the doorway. Ethan was standing there, leaning against the frame. The blue light from his phone cast an eerie glow on his face. He was scrolling, his thumb moving up, endlessly. He'd heard her. He'd seen it all. He didn't look up. He didn't say a word. His silence was his signature on her cruelty, his passive endorsement of her slow, methodical campaign to dismantle me. He was a silent accomplice, a willing spectator to my humiliation. Chloe turned and walked out, her footsteps light and unbothered. Ethan remained for a second longer, his face still bathed in that cold digital light, before he too turned and disappeared down the hall. The darkness in the room felt absolute now. I lifted my arm, the plastic bracelet on my wrist feeling impossibly heavy. It was no longer a safety device. It was a symbol of their power, a dead weight tethering me to their whims. Its battery would slowly drain, its potential to save me dying along with the last vestiges of my hope. It was a small cruelty, yes, but it was also a promise of all the larger cruelties to come, and in the suffocating quiet of my room, I finally understood. This wasn't just neglect. This was war. To the world, I am Mia Sterling. Just Mia. The name feels like a borrowed coat, one I've worn for so long the fabric has molded to my shoulders, but I can still feel the seams of a life that belonged to someone else. They see me as the widow of Richard Sterling, a man whose charisma was a force of nature, a gravity that pulled everyone into his orbit. His official title, the one etched on the discreet business cards he'd hand out at embassy parties, was government consultant, a title so vague and yet so heavy with importance it silenced any further questions. People just nodded, their eyes wide with a mixture of respect and curiosity they knew better than to voice. And I was his shadow, the quiet, unassuming librarian he'd swept off her feet. That was the story we told, the legend we crafted together. I was the devoted wife, the anchor to his wandering, important life, following him from one capital city to another. My life was a collection of rented houses with unfamiliar smells, of learning just enough of a language to buy groceries and smile politely at neighbors I would never truly know. I was the woman who organized his files, who made sure his favorite scotch was always stocked, who hosted dinners for men with guarded eyes and tight smiles. I was an accessory to his brilliance, a footnote in the biography of a great man. When he died, the story simply entered its final chapter. A sudden, massive heart attack, the doctor had said. A man like Richard, always running at full throttle, was bound to burn out. It was a tragic but fitting end. And so, I became the grieving widow. It was a role I was expected to play, and one I performed with the quiet dignity everyone anticipated. 6 months ago, my son Ethan and his wife Chloe moved me from our life of quiet prestige into their grand suburban home in a place called Maple Creek, Oregon, a town with manicured lawns and a sense of orderly peace that felt more alien to me than the bustling markets of Istanbul. This house is a monument to their success. Polished oak floors that gleam under recessed lighting, a kitchen with more stainless steel than a surgical theater, and vast windows that look out onto a painfully perfect green lawn. I was supposed to be grateful. A plaque by the door, a housewarming gift from one of Chloe's friends, reads, "The Sterling Residence." I see it every day. I was a Sterling, yet I felt like a guest, a piece of antique furniture they had inherited and weren't quite sure where to put. They would speak to me in that slow, loud voice people reserve for the very old or the very simple. They'd tell me, "Mom, we're so glad you're here. You shouldn't be alone." And I would nod and smile, the quiet, slightly lost widow, just as the script demanded. But the truth is, a stubborn thing. It lives in the spaces between words, in the memories that flicker behind my eyes when I'm staring out at the rain-slicked Oregon street. The truth is, I retired from the field long before Richard did. He wasn't just my husband. For a decade before that, he was my handler. I wasn't a librarian he'd met in a dusty university hall. I was his most reliable asset, a ghost who could slip through cities unseen. The quiet, unassuming woman was the perfect cover, a role I played so well that eventually we both started to believe it. He taught me how to read the subtle tells in a person's posture, how to hear the lie coiled beneath a confident statement, how to map a room in seconds, exits, threats, assets. He was my mentor, my commander, and then my husband. Our love was real, but it was a love forged in secrets and shared danger, a language no one else could ever understand. When I became pregnant with Ethan, Richard insisted I come in from the cold for good. "It's for your safety, Mia," he'd said, his hand on my stomach, his eyes filled with a sincerity I wanted desperately to trust. Our safety. And so I retired. I traded dead drops for diaper changes, surveillance for school plays. I packed away the woman who could assemble a weapon in the dark and became the woman who perfected a sourdough starter. I dedicated myself to Ethan, pouring all the focus and fierce loyalty I once gave to my missions into him. I wanted him to have a normal life, a life untouched by the shadows his parents walked in. The money, of course, was the biggest secret of all. Richard's government salary was comfortable, but it didn't build empires. It didn't pay for the sprawling house in Maple Creek, or the European cars in the driveway, or Chloe's designer clothes. That wealth came from me. When I retired, I wasn't just given a handshake and a pension. There are no 401ks in that line of work. There is only a severance, a ghost account, a sum delivered in untraceable funds that represents a lifetime of risk. It was my parachute, my escape plan, my reward for years of service to a country that would never acknowledge my name. I called it my retirement fund. Richard called it a necessary precaution. Ethan, my brilliant, hopeful son, inherited his father's charm, but none of his pragmatism. He had a string of tech ventures, each one more ambitious and ill-conceived than the last. He would come to us, his shoulders slumped in defeat, talking about seed funding that fell through or market shifts he couldn't predict. And Richard, with a knowing look at me, would discover a forgotten investment that had suddenly matured, a stock portfolio he'd forgotten about, a shrewd land deal from years ago. It was a performance. The money was mine. I would funnel it to him, laundering my operational funds through Richard's memory to protect my son's fragile pride. I let Ethan believe he was the son of a financial genius, not the beneficiary of a woman who had earned that money in ways he could never imagine. I bought this house. I chose the plot of land, not for its view, but for its strategic lines of sight and multiple egress points. Old habits die hard. I approved the blueprints, ensuring the foundation was reinforced in ways no suburban contractor would understand. I paid for every beam, every pane of glass, every polished faucet, all from a distance, through layers of shell corporations and financial instruments that made it look like a final, brilliant, posthumous investment from his father. I built this gilded cage for my son and his family, a fortress of comfort and security paid for with a life of secrets. And now, as I sit in the armchair they placed for me in the corner of the living room, an heirloom they tolerate, I feel the chill of the gilded bars. They have started to see the cage not as a gift, but as their own territory, and they were beginning to figure out where they could lock away the woman who built it. I watch them, Chloe with her dismissive glances, Ethan with his averted eyes, and I use the skills they don't know I have. I observe, I listen, and I remember everything. It started with the boxes, not mine but Chloe's. Expensive, empty boxes from designer brands she'd bought online, now stacked in the hallway outside my bedroom door. It was a subtle eviction notice. A few days later, Ethan approached me, his eyes fixed on a point just over my shoulder. "Mom," he began, the words sounding foreign in his mouth, "we've been thinking. The stairs are getting to be a lot for you. We've set up a nice, cozy space for you downstairs. In the basement. No more stairs. It's for your own good." He didn't help me pack. A hired mover, a young man with pity in his eyes, carried my few belongings down the steep, narrow steps. The air changed with every step down. The warm, sunlit air of the main house, scented with Chloe's expensive diffusers, gave way to a cold, damp chill that smelled of earth and mildew and something else, something like neglect. My new home was a concrete box. A single bare bulb hung from a wire in the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows. The only window was a small, grimy slit near the ceiling, at ground level with the garden outside. My view of the world was now limited to the muddy undersides of Chloe's prize-winning rose bushes and the occasional scuttling legs of a spider. The bed was a simple metal cot, the mattress thin and lumpy. They'd left one of my old armchairs, but its floral pattern seemed garish and sad in the gloom. This wasn't a room. It was a holding cell. That first evening, the sounds of their life drifted down through the floorboards. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, the cheerful theme song of some game show on the television. I sat on the edge of the cot, my hands clasped in my lap, listening to the muffled sounds of the family I no longer belonged to. Hours passed. My stomach rumbled. Finally, I heard footsteps on the basement stairs. It was Chloe, holding a plate. "Here you go," she said, her voice bright and false. She didn't enter the room, just stood at the threshold as if afraid the poverty of the space might be contagious. She handed me the plate. It was blue plastic, the kind you buy for toddlers. On it was a plastic fork and a plastic spoon. "We just thought this would be easier for you. You know, since your hands aren't so steady anymore, less chance of breaking anything." The food was a piece of dry chicken and some cold, watery mashed potatoes. I knew from the smells that had wafted down earlier that they had eaten roasted lamb with rosemary and garlic. I took the plate without a word. My silence was a wall I was slowly building around myself. "Oh, and from now on, let's make a deal," she added, a teacher addressing a difficult child. "After we eat, you can come up and do the dishes, and then you can have your dinner. It'll give you something to do, keep you active." She smiled, a tight, triumphant little smile, and then she was gone, leaving me in the semi-darkness with my plastic plate and my cold meal. I ate slowly, each bite a reminder of my new station. I was no longer the matriarch. I wasn't even a guest. I was a chore, a burden to be managed. The dinner parties became my personal circle of hell. Chloe loved to entertain her friends, women with smooth, unlined faces and sharp, assessing eyes. Twice, maybe 3 times a week, the house would fill with loud chatter and the cloying scent of perfume. On those nights, I was part of the pre-dinner entertainment. "Everyone, this is Ethan's mother, Mia," Chloe would announce, her hand on my shoulder, guiding me out of the shadows of the hallway like a show pony. "She lives with us. It's such a blessing to be able to care for her in her twilight years." The friends would murmur sympathetically. Their eyes would scan over my simple cardigan, my worn slippers. They'd ask me gentle, condescending questions. "Are they taking good care of you, dear? You're so lucky to have such a wonderful family." I would nod and smile, a vacant, pleasant expression I had perfected. I was a relic, a piece of quaint antique furniture they could admire for a moment before turning back to their wine and gossip. Once the performance was over, I would retreat to the basement and wait. I'd listen to them feast, the sounds of their forks scraping against fine china, a form of torture. I'd hear them laugh at Ethan's jokes. I'd hear Chloe complain in a stage whisper about the rising cost of organic produce. The true work began after the last guest departed. I would climb the stairs into a kitchen that looked like a war zone, a mountain of plates caked with dried food, smeared with expensive sauces, wine glasses stained with red lipstick. A greasy roasting pan that took all my strength to lift into the sink. My hands, gnarled with age, would turn red and raw in the hot, soapy water. I scrubbed and rinsed and dried, the scent of their feast clinging to my clothes. Ethan and Chloe would sit at the kitchen island, scrolling through their phones. Sometimes they'd talk about me as if I wasn't there. "Did you see her face when Mrs. Davenport asked about her old house?" Chloe would snicker. "Not a clue, just blank." "She's getting worse," Ethan would grunt, not looking up from his screen. I never said a word. I just kept washing. Only when the last plate was dried and put away, when the counters were wiped clean, and the kitchen was once again pristine, was I allowed to eat. Chloe would scrape the leftovers from their plates onto my plastic one. Congealed risotto, a few limp spears of asparagus, the fatty end of a steak. I would take my tribute and descend back into my tomb, eating alone in the cold, the hum of the furnace my only companion. They started documenting it. The decline they were so eager to see began to be cataloged with the cold, unblinking eye of Chloe's smartphone. It wasn't a secret. It was a performance, and I was the unwilling star. "Mom, look at me," Chloe would say, her voice syrupy sweet, the phone held up to capture my face. "What day is it today? Come on, you know this." I'd hesitate, not because I didn't know, but because the question was a trap. The camera lens was a black hole, sucking the certainty right out of me. "It's Tuesday." "No, it's Wednesday. See, Ethan?" she'd say, turning the phone towards him. He'd be on the sofa, feigning interest in a sports channel, but I could feel his attention on us. She's completely losing track of time. What if there's a fire? She wouldn't even know how to call for help. Ethan would just grunt, a low, non-committal sound from deep in his chest. It was his signature contribution. His grunt was agreement. His grunt was permission. The interrogations became a daily ritual, a modern form of water torture, drip by drip. They were never about simple facts. They were designed to disorient. "Mom, tell me about the trip we took to the Grand Canyon. What was the name of that hotel we stayed at? The one with the blue shutters?" We had never been to the Grand Canyon. The trip was a fiction, a memory she had invented just to watch me struggle to grasp it. My confusion would be met with a sigh of disappointment, all of it recorded for posterity. "Who is the current vice president? You used to watch the news all the time. What did Richard's father do for a living? You must remember that." The questions came in a rapid-fire burst, leaving me no time to process one before the next was launched. My hesitation, my stammered answers, my eventual weary silence, it was all evidence. Every frame was another brick in the wall of my supposed incompetence. They were building a case, not out of concern, but out of greed. They were creating a digital ghost of a woman who was frail, confused, and fading. A woman who desperately needed her loving son to take control of her affairs. Sometimes, Chloe would try to be clever. She'd place two objects on the table in front of me, a salt shaker and a pepper shaker. "Okay, Mom, for the camera. Which one is the salt?" she'd ask, as if testing a toddler. The humiliation was the point. It was meant to break me down, to make me believe their version of reality. Through it all, my grandson Leo was a silent witness. He was 14, at that awkward age where boys are all sharp angles and simmering resentment. He would appear in doorways or at the top of the stairs, a shadow in the periphery of their little theatrical production. He never spoke, he never joined in. He just watched. His face was a mask of stoic fury I recognized with a chilling certainty. It was the face of an operative behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, assessing the threat. His eyes, so much like mine, would meet mine for a fleeting second, and in them I saw not pity, but a shared, silent rage. Chloe, oblivious, would sometimes try to draw him in. "Leo, honey, come and give Grandma a kiss for the camera. Show everyone how much we all love her." Leo wouldn't move. He would just stand there, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on his mother with an unnerving intensity. He would give a slight shake of his head, a small, defiant gesture that spoke volumes. Chloe would falter, her bright smile flickering for a moment. She'd dismiss it with an airy laugh. "Oh, teenagers." But I saw the flash of annoyance in her eyes. Leo was a variable she couldn't control, a glitch in her perfectly curated narrative. He saw the truth. And his silence was not one of submission, but of judgment. One night, the despair felt heavier than usual. The dampness of the basement seemed to have seeped into my bones, a permanent, gnawing ache. Above me, the house was quiet, the party was over, the dishes were done. I lay on my cot, staring at the concrete ceiling, feeling the last embers of my old self dying out. I was trapped. I was being erased, one video clip at a time. I closed my eyes, a single hot tear tracing a path through the grime on my cheek. In that moment, I truly believed they had won. Then, I heard it. Not a knock, not a footstep. It was a soft, sliding sound from under my door, a whisper of paper against the dusty concrete floor. I sat up, my heart suddenly pounding a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. I swung my legs off the cot, my bare feet cold on the floor, and crept towards the door. There, in the dim light filtering from the hallway above, was a small, folded piece of paper. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. It was a sheet of cheap printer paper, still slightly warm from the machine. I unfolded it carefully. It was a printout of a text message exchange. My eyes scanned the words, my old training kicking in, processing information with a speed and clarity that belied the frail old woman I was pretending to be. The names at the top were Chloe and Ethan. Chloe: "The lawyer says we need more. The videos are good, but he wants something definitive, something that proves she can't manage on her own." Ethan: "What more does he want? We're doing everything." Chloe: "He mentioned getting the POA updated, a new one. He said if we can get her signature on that, it's game over." Ethan: "She'll never sign it if she knows what it is." Chloe: "She won't know. I'll tell her it's a permission slip for Leo's school trip or something. You just get her to sign it tomorrow. She'll do it for you." Ethan: "Okay, I'll handle it tomorrow. Power of attorney." The letters burned themselves into my mind. It wasn't about care. It wasn't about concern. It was a legal coup. They were planning to seize control of everything, to officially declare me a non-person. The coldness of it, the casual cruelty in their typed words, was more chilling than the basement air. My eyes drifted to the bottom of the page. Below the text exchange, drawn in black marker, was a small, simple drawing. It was a face, just a circle with 2 dots for eyes and a downturned curve for a mouth. A little sad face. Leo. It wasn't just a piece of intelligence. It was a message, a signal, an act of defiance from the one person in that house who saw me not as a burden or a bank account, but as a human being. In the sterile, cruel world they had constructed, this small, childish drawing was an anchor of humanity. It told me I wasn't crazy. It told me I wasn't alone. A strange calm settled over me, pushing back the despair. The ache in my bones was still there, but it was now joined by a surge of cold, hard adrenaline I hadn't felt in decades. The old instincts, buried under years of grief and feigned senility, began to stir. The board was set, the pieces were moving, and the game had been exposed. I looked from the cruel words of my son to the simple, empathetic drawing of my grandson. The war had a new soldier, and he had just handed me my first weapon. The world shrinks when you live in a basement. It becomes a universe of 4 damp walls, the low rumble of the furnace, and the single grime-streaked window that looks out onto the uncaring feet of the world. For 3 days, a new celestial body had entered my tiny orbit, a nondescript gray sedan, parked directly across the street. It never moved. The windows were tinted, reflecting the drab sky with an impassive sheen. It wasn't police. The posture was wrong, too patient, too still. It wasn't private security. They were always flashier, eager to be noticed. This was something else, something from a language I had spent a lifetime trying to forget. I watched it from my sliver of a view, my heart a slow, steady drum against my ribs. It was a predator, I was sure of it, but I couldn't tell if I was the prey or the reason for its hunt. On the fourth day, the car was gone. The space it occupied seemed unnervingly empty, a missing tooth in the street's grin. I felt a prickle of unease, the kind that comes not from a visible threat, but from the sudden absence of one. I busied myself with the meaningless chores Chloe assigned me, polishing silver she never used, sorting through old magazines for recycling. Anything to keep my hands moving and my mind from spinning. It was later, when the afternoon sun slanted low and cast long shadows into my subterranean world, that I saw it. Resting on the exterior ledge of my window, almost invisible against the stained concrete, was a small, dark disk. My breath caught. It was impossible. I forced my stiff joints to cooperate, pushing the window open just enough to slide my hand out. My fingers, wrinkled and spotted with age, closed around the object. It was cool, heavy, its edges worn smooth by time. I drew it inside, my hand trembling slightly. It wasn't a modern coin. It was ancient silver, dark with tarnish, a denarius. The profile of a long-dead Caesar stared up at me, his stony gaze as unreadable as the man in the sedan. The coin wasn't a gift. It was a message, a key. 30 years ago, in a life I had sealed away like a tomb, this was the signal. A cleaner, a specialist in erasing problems, people, and histories. His name was Silas. He was a ghost then, and I assumed he was dust now. Richard had arranged the contingency, a last resort for an operative in deep cover with no way out. The denarius meant Silas was activated. It meant he was here. But the signal had a chilling ambiguity Richard had found poetic. Was he here to clean up my problem? Or was he here to clean me up? To bury the last loose end of a dead spy master's life? I closed my fist around the coin, the cold metal a stark contrast to the sudden fire in my veins. The game had changed. Or perhaps the old game had just found me again. The next move wasn't mine to make. It came a few days later, delivered by a mailman who had no idea he was handing me a declaration of war. It was a thick, formal envelope, addressed to me. Inside, the legalese was dense and suffocating, but the message was brutally clear. Ethan and Chloe had filed a petition for conservatorship. They were making a legal claim on my life, my mind, my assets, the very assets I had provided. The petition was filled with clinical, cruel descriptions of my cognitive decline, my episodes of confusion, my inability to manage my own affairs. Their lawyer, a name I saw repeated throughout the document, Mr. Davies, had already painted me as a doddering, incompetent burden, a problem to be managed. The court, in its infinite and detached wisdom, assigned me a public defender. Her name was Sarah. She came to the house, and Chloe let her in with a performance of syrupy concern, ushering her down to my basement room as if I were a delicate, potentially contagious patient. Sarah was young, her suit was slightly rumpled, and her eyes held a permanent exhaustion that had nothing to do with me. She was drowning in cases, in human misery, and I was just one more file on her cluttered desk. She sat on the edge of the lumpy cot they called my bed, her briefcase open on her lap. She spoke to me in that slow, gentle voice people use for children and the very old. "Mia," she began, her expression a careful blend of professionalism and pity. "I've reviewed the petition from your son and his wife. I know this is very difficult." I stayed in character, the confused, slightly frail old woman. I hunched my shoulders, let my hands tremble in my lap. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice thin and reedy. "My son, Ethan wouldn't—" "These situations are always complicated," she said, sidestepping the lie. "Mr. Davies, their attorney, he's very aggressive. He's built a strong case. They have video recordings, Mia. They have a signed power of attorney document." My heart gave a painful thud. A power of attorney. Richard. "My advice," Sarah continued, leaning forward, her voice dropping to a confidential tone, "is to consider a settlement. We can negotiate. Perhaps a limited conservatorship, where you retain some autonomy but your son manages the finances. It's the best you can hope for, Mia. If this goes to a hearing, given the evidence they claim to have, it could be much worse. You could lose everything. I looked at her, this well-meaning, overwhelmed young woman. She saw a victim. She saw a sad story with a predictable ending. She didn't see a veteran of 1,000 silent wars. She didn't see the woman who could spot a tail in 3 continents or dismantle a bomb with shaking hands. She saw what Ethan and Chloe wanted her to see, and in that moment I knew my first battle would be with the very person assigned to defend me. A settlement, I repeated, letting my voice crack. I see. I saw it all. I saw the neat, tidy box they were building for me, and I saw that Sarah, my own lawyer, was holding the hammer and nails. The preliminary meeting was held in a sterile conference room at Davies's law firm. The air conditioning was too high, and the polished mahogany table reflected our distorted faces. Ethan sat beside me, refusing to meet my eye, his face a mask of strained filial duty. Chloe sat next to him, a portrait of worried grace, occasionally dabbing at a dry eye with a tissue. Across the table, Mr. Davies presided like a vulture in a $1,000 suit. He was all sharp angles and predatory smiles. Sarah sat beside me, shuffling papers, already looking defeated. "Let's be clear," Davies began, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. "My clients are here out of love and concern. Their only desire is to protect Mia and to honor the final wishes of her late husband, the esteemed Richard Sterling." He slid a document across the table. "This is a power of attorney, signed by Mr. Sterling 6 months before his passing, granting his son Ethan full and sole control over all of his assets in the event of his death or his wife's incapacitation." Sarah picked it up. I leaned over, feigning difficulty with my vision. I saw Richard's signature at the bottom. It was perfect. The confident, arrogant slant, the sharp R, and the decisive slash of the D. It was a flawless replica, and it was a complete and utter forgery. I knew it in my bones. Richard would have sooner set his fortune on fire than grant his financially inept son control over a single penny. He trusted no one, least of all his own blood. This was Chloe's work. I glanced at her. She was watching me, a flicker of triumphant cruelty in her eyes before it was masked again by concern. She was good, meticulous, patient. She would have practiced for weeks, tracing his signature from old letters, from legal documents, until she could replicate it in her sleep. She had the steady hand of a surgeon and the soul of a ghoul. "As you can see," Davies said, steepling his fingers, "Richard was a man who planned ahead. This is ironclad." Sarah looked at the signature, then at me. "Mia? Did you know about this?" I looked at the paper, letting my gaze drift as if I couldn't focus. "Richard, he handled everything," I murmured. "I don't remember. My memory is so—" I let the sentence trail off, a perfect imitation of the senility they accused me of. I let them think they were winning. I let them build their cage around me, bar by bar. But as I stared at that forged signature, I wasn't feeling defeated. I was feeling a cold, clarifying rage. They hadn't just lied. They had desecrated a memory, using the ghost of a man I had known, to strip me of my life. They had underestimated me, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. That night, the damp chill of the basement felt less like a prison and more like a command bunker. I waited until the house was silent, until the rhythmic snores of Ethan and Chloe echoed faintly through the floorboards. Leo's light was still on. I had seen it, a sliver under his door. I crept up the stairs, my movement silent, a ghost in my own home. I knocked softly on his door. He opened it a crack, his young face etched with worry. He looked so much like Ethan, but without the weakness that had curdled his father's soul. "Grandma, are you okay?" I didn't answer. I just opened my palm. The ancient Roman coin sat there, its silver face dull in the dim hallway light. I didn't explain what it was. I didn't have to. For Leo, a boy raised on video games and fantasy novels, a secret object from his mysterious grandmother was a language he understood perfectly. It was a quest item, a token of a hidden world. His eyes widened, first at the coin, then at my face. He saw the intent there, the seriousness that went beyond a simple late-night visit. "Do you have more?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. He understood immediately. More what? More proof. More secrets. More of the truth he had tried to give me on that crumpled piece of paper. He gave a single sharp nod. "Wait here," he mouthed. He returned a minute later with a small black object. "And a thumb drive. Everything," he whispered, pressing it into my hand. "I put a program on their computer. It records the microphone whenever the laptop is open. They talk a lot. About you." I closed my hand around the drive. It was warm from his pocket. "You are a good boy, Leo," I said, and the words felt heavy, inadequate for the risk he was taking. He was my only soldier, a child fighting a war he shouldn't even know existed. Back in my cell, I used an old, untraceable tablet I had kept hidden in the lining of a suitcase, a relic from another life. The drive held over 200 hours of audio, 200 hours of my son and his wife plotting my demise. I put in a cheap pair of earbuds and I listened. I listened to them mocking my dementia. I listened to Chloe laughing as she described unplugging my medical alert bracelet. "Saves on the electric bill," she'd cackled. "And it's not like the old bat is going anywhere." I listened to Ethan, my son, my only child, agreeing with her, his voice thick with a mixture of greed and resentment. "Davies says the POA is our ace in the hole. Once we have control of the accounts, we can move her to a state facility, a nice one, of course." The lie was so casual, so practiced. I listened as they rehearsed the questions they would ask me on camera, designed to trip me up, to make me look confused. "Ask her about Berlin in '92, Chloe suggested. "She always gets flustered when you mention Berlin." The audio was my ammunition. It was a litany of their crimes, a map of their greed. But it was my word against theirs. A trove of secret recordings provided by a child, presented by a woman they were successfully painting as senile and vindictive. Who would a judge believe, the concerned, loving son, or the confused old mother who was suddenly producing spy movie evidence? The recordings were everything, and they were nothing. The mention of Berlin sent a jolt of ice through me. It wasn't just a random memory. It was a ghost I had lived with for 30 years. My greatest fear wasn't the courtroom, or Davies, or even losing the money. It was a ghost from 1992. Berlin. The wall had fallen, but the city was still a nest of shadows and lies. Richard was running an operation, recruiting a high-level Stasi defector. But Richard had gotten arrogant, sloppy. He'd missed the signs of a double cross. The operation was blown, and our asset, a young physicist with a wife and 2 children, was found floating in the Spree River. It was Richard's fault, a career-ending, life-ending mistake. And I covered for him. I was his records officer, his Cassandra. I stayed up for 48 hours, fueled by black coffee and sheer terror, and I falsified the after-action report. I created a new timeline, invented a phantom informant, and buried Richard's catastrophic error under a mountain of bureaucratic lies. I saved his career. I saved him. He never thanked me. He didn't have to. For the rest of our marriage, the lie was always there, an invisible chain he held. Every time I questioned him, every time I pushed back, he would give me a certain look, a quiet, knowing smile, and sometimes he would just say, "Remember Berlin, darling." He knew I would never risk exposing the lie, because it would not only destroy his legacy, it would destroy mine. It was a federal crime. I would go to prison. The guilt I felt over the death of that young man was as fresh and as suffocating as the mold on my basement walls. If Davies dug deep enough, if he started subpoenaing old government files to investigate my past, my own history would be the weapon that destroyed me. They didn't even know it, but Chloe and Ethan were threatening to unearth a grave I had dug for myself 3 decades ago. I had to find the original power of attorney. The real one. Not the forgery Chloe had so skillfully crafted. Richard was paranoid, but he was also meticulous. He would have had a failsafe, a hard copy of all his most important documents stored somewhere secure, somewhere off-site, somewhere only he knew, or somewhere only I knew he would choose. He was a creature of habit and arrogance. He believed no one would ever think to look in the most obvious of places. under the groaning, ancient furnace in the corner of my basement. It was his go-to spot in every house we'd ever lived in. A loose floorboard, hidden beneath decades of dust and grime. He thought it was clever. I thought it was sentimental. One night, armed with a butter knife from my plastic utensil collection, I waited until the house was deep in slumber. The concrete floor was cold against my knees. The air was thick with the smell of dust and damp earth. I worked the knife into the seam of a floorboard near the furnace's base. It was stuck fast. I put all my weight into it, my old muscles screaming in protest. With a low groan of stressed wood, the board came loose. My heart pounded. I reached into the dark, dusty cavity beneath. My fingers brushed against something, not a hard drive case or a manila envelope. It was leather, cool and smooth. I pulled it out. It wasn't a document file. It was a book. A handsome, leather-bound ledger, the kind used for accounting, the kind Richard had always used for our household finances. I carried it over to my small cot, my hands shaking. This had to be it. The original documents tucked inside. I opened the cover. The first page wasn't a list of stocks or bank accounts. It was handwritten, in Richard's precise, elegant script. The title at the top of the page made the air leave my lungs. SVR accounts, active, handler, Volkov. SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. It wasn't his financials. It was his real work. Page after page, a detailed, chilling account of a 30-year career as a double agent. Names of CIA assets he had sold out, operations he had sabotaged, payments received, routed through a complex web of shell corporations. The Berlin operation was there. He hadn't botched it. He had deliberately sacrificed our asset to protect a more valuable Russian source. He had let me believe I was covering up his incompetence, when in reality, I had been an unwitting accomplice to his treason. I had forged a federal document to help a traitor sell out his country. The guilt I'd carried for 30 years was a lie, a tool he had used to control me. I felt sick. The room began to spin. This man, this stranger I had been married to for 40 years, the man I had grieved. My hand trembled as I turned the pages, a blur of names and dates and betrayals. I reached the final entry. It was dated just 2 days before his death. It wasn't about finances or operations. It was a plan. Subject, Cassandra, Mia. My old agency code name. My blood ran cold. Asset compromised. Knowledge of protocols makes her a liability. Potential for exposure is high following my retirement. Plan. Stage fatal accident, fall down stairs, or fast-acting heart failure. Untraceable. Payout from SVR on confirmation. 2M. He was going to kill me. The loving husband, the decorated government advisor, the man whose honor I thought I was protecting, had put a $2 million price tag on my head. And then, the memory hit me, sharp and vivid as a lightning strike. That last night, Richard, sitting in his favorite leather armchair, complaining of indigestion, me, bringing him his evening scotch. Him, taking a long drink, smiling that quiet, knowing smile he always used when he thought he had the upper hand. To us, darling, he'd said. To a long and peaceful retirement. His heart attack hadn't been natural. It hadn't been an accident. It was me. A single, untraceable dose of aconitine distilled from a wolfsbane plant in my own garden slipped into his scotch. A contingency of my own. A poison so potent and so fast, it mimics a massive coronary. I had done it because I'd felt the shift in him, a coldness in his eyes that I'd seen only once before, in the eyes of an assassin in Vienna just before he tried to kill me. I thought he was planning to leave me, to disappear and leave me with nothing. I had acted on pure animal instinct. Self-preservation. I hadn't known how right I was. I hadn't grieved a husband. I had survived an executioner. The ledger slipped from my fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. The whole world had just tilted on its axis, and I was standing in the ruins of a life that had never been real. I wasn't a victim anymore. I wasn't just fighting for my money or my freedom. I was fighting the ghost of the man who tried to murder me, and his greedy, oblivious heirs. And for the first time in a very long time, I had a weapon they would never see coming. My performance of a lifetime began not on a stage, but in the damp, musty air of a basement that smelled of mildew and forgotten things. The discovery of Richard's betrayal, his plan to have me eliminated, had not broken me. It had forged the last of my grief and fear into something cold, hard, and sharp. The game had changed. They thought they were the predators, circling a weak, old woman. They had no idea they were trapped in a cage with a tiger. My new role was Cassandra, the befuddled grandmother, and I would play it to perfection. The key was to lull them into a state of supreme confidence. Every tremble, every vacant stare, every misplaced word was a carefully calibrated piece of theater. I became a master of the dropped spoon, the forgotten name, the long, rambling story that went nowhere. I could see the smirks exchanged between Ethan and Chloe over my head at the dinner table, the one I was only allowed to sit at when they had no guests. They believed they were winning. They believed I was crumbling. That was precisely what I needed. The laptop was the symphony's first movement, Chloe's prized possession, a sleek, silver machine she used for everything from online shopping to editing her damning little videos of me. She would sit at the kitchen island for hours, a cruel smile playing on her lips as she spliced together clips of me looking confused, muttering to myself, or struggling to answer their baiting questions. "See, Ethan?" she'd say, her voice dripping with mock concern. "She's completely gone. This will be a slam dunk in court." We're doing her a favor, really. Ethan, my son, would just grunt in agreement, his eyes fixed on his phone, scrolling through stock market tickers. He had outsourced his conscience to his wife, and she was spending it with gleeful abandon. They were so engrossed in their own narrative, their own greed, that they never once looked up to see the calculating mind behind the demented eyes watching them. My opportunity came on a Tuesday morning. The air was thick with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and Chloe's self-satisfaction. She had just finished a new video montage, a particularly nasty one that made me look like a ghost haunting my own life. She'd turned the laptop to show Ethan, who gave a brief, approving nod before returning to his phone. "This is perfect, babe. Absolutely perfect," Chloe purred, leaving the laptop open on the edge of the counter while she went to the pantry. My heart was a block of ice in my chest, beating a slow, steady, tactical rhythm. I stood up from my small, rickety chair in the corner, my movements deliberately slow and unsteady. I was holding my mug, a cheap ceramic one they'd given me, while theirs were fine porcelain. I shuffled towards the counter, my eyes fixed on the coffee pot. More coffee," I mumbled, making my voice sound reedy and thin. "Mom, you just had some," Ethan said, not even looking up. "Just sit down. You'll spill it." It was the perfect cue. As if his words were a physical force, I stumbled. My body, trained for decades to move with silent grace, executed a flawless impression of geriatric clumsiness. My arm, which could still break a man's wrist, jerked forward as if by accident. The full mug of hot black coffee tilted, a perfect arc of dark liquid soaring through the air. It was a beautiful, destructive ballet. The coffee hit the keyboard of Chloe's laptop with a sharp, sizzling hiss. A spray of brown droplets splattered across the screen, obscuring her own smug face in the video she'd just been admiring. For a split second, there was silence. Then, the screen flickered, turned a garish blue, and went black. Chloe's shriek was everything I had hoped for. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and disbelief. "My laptop! Oh my God, what did you do?" I recoiled, my eyes wide with feigned horror and confusion. I made my hands tremble, rattling the empty mug against the counter. Oh dear. I'm so sorry, Chloe. I tripped. My old legs." My voice was a masterpiece of pathetic apology. "You clumsy old fool," she screamed, rushing to the laptop, frantically dabbing at it with a dish towel. "This cost a fortune. All my files, my videos." Ethan finally looked up, his expression one of pure annoyance, not at his wife's cruelty, but at the inconvenience. "For God's sake, Mom, look what you've done." "This is exactly why we can't have you wandering around. You're a liability." I'm so sorry," I whispered. letting a single, genuine tear of triumph roll down my cheek. It was a stellar performance. I could feel the ghost of Richard, my old handler, nodding in approval from whatever circle of hell he now occupied. Chloe spent the rest of the day in a fury, taking the laptop to a repair shop. The verdict came back that evening. The motherboard was fried. Some data might be recoverable from the hard drive, but it would be expensive and time-consuming. Crucially, the most recent files she had been working on, the video compilations stored in the device's temporary cache and not yet backed up to the cloud, were gone forever. She glared at me with pure hatred for the rest of the night, a look I absorbed with the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. They saw an accident. I saw a successful surgical strike. Their confidence was still high, but I had just destroyed a key piece of their ammunition, and they didn't even know it was an attack. The next phase required reaching out. The Roman denarius felt cool and heavy in my palm, a solid link to a world I had supposedly left behind. It was a contingency, a lifeline Richard had never known about. He thought he controlled all my assets, all my connections. He was wrong. For 3 days, I watched the strange car parked across the street through the grimy basement window. It was a nondescript sedan, the kind that was designed to be forgotten. It never moved. It was a sign. Silas was in play. I needed to signal back. Getting out of the house was the first challenge. I waited for a day when Chloe had a charity luncheon, and Ethan was at one of his endless, fruitless investor meetings. They locked me in the basement, as they usually did, but they underestimated my knowledge of this house, the house I had paid for. A loose pane in the small window, a bit of pressure in the right spot, and I was able to slide it open. It was a tight squeeze, but my body was still lean. I slithered out into the overgrown bushes at the side of the house, my movements as silent as a cat's. The lamppost was 2 blocks away, at the corner of a quiet, tree-lined street. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with a resurgent adrenaline I hadn't felt in years. I felt alive. I pulled a small piece of white chalk from my pocket, pilfered from Leo's old art supplies. With a few quick, practiced strokes, I drew the symbol on the base of the lamppost, a simple, almost invisible rendering of the constellation Cassiopeia. My call sign, Cassandra. I slipped back into the basement prison as silently as I had left. The wait was the hardest part. Every creak of the floorboards above, every passing car sent a jolt through my system. Had I been seen? Had I misread the signs? The next afternoon, the mail arrived. Leo, my quiet, watchful grandson, was the one who brought it in. He had started doing it ever since he overheard his parents' plan. He was my little spy, my Trojan horse inside their walls. He would sort the mail, and if anything looked unusual, he would slip it to me when he brought down my meager dinner tray. That evening, tucked beneath a flimsy plastic plate holding a cold, congealed piece of lasagna, was a small, plain, white envelope. It had no stamp, no address. My name was not on it. Inside was not a letter, but a small, black burner phone. It was impossibly thin and light. I pressed the power button. The screen lit up with a single word, call. There was only one number programmed into it. I waited until the house was completely dark and silent, until the rhythmic snores of Ethan and Chloe echoed faintly through the floorboards. I huddled in the farthest corner of the basement, wrapping myself in a threadbare blanket to muffle my voice. I dialed the number. It rang only once before a voice answered, a voice like gravel and smoke that I hadn't heard in 30 years. Cassandra. It wasn't a question. Silas, I breathed, the name feeling foreign and familiar on my tongue. It's been a while. Time gets away from you, he said, his tone devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a professional, a cleaner. The car was a wellness check. Richard's network has been noisy. We heard whispers about his unfortunate passing, assumed you were retired, or worse. I am retired, I said, but I've been reactivated. Not by choice. I gave him the short, brutal version, the financial ruin, the abuse, the guardianship hearing. I left out the part about Richard being a traitor. That was my secret to wield, not to share. Spies don't share. They leverage. There was a long silence on the other end, I could almost hear the gears turning in his meticulous, orderly mind. Silas was a man who tidied up messes, and my life was a very big mess. "They've filed for guardianship," I continued. "I have a court-appointed lawyer. She's young, inexperienced, thinks I should settle." "Give me her name," Silas said. "Sarah Klein, Public Defender's Office." "And the judge?" "Not assigned yet. The hearing is in 3 weeks." "I'll make some inquiries," Silas said. "There's a man, a retired federal judge, Arthur Vance. He owes you." I remembered Arthur. A messy situation in East Berlin back in '88. A compromised asset, a botched exfiltration. I had pulled him out of the fire, fabricating a report that saved his career and likely his life. He owed me more than a favor. He owed me his entire comfortable retirement. "Vance is a good man," I said. "He's a man who pays his debts," Silas corrected. "He'll have a consultation with Miss Klein, an off-the-record chat about the finer points of elder law and the importance of zealous advocacy. She'll come away illuminated. And the hearing? I'll see what can be done about the judge assignment. The old network still has friends in quiet places. Don't call this number again. A new device will find its way to you if needed. Stay strong, Cassandra." The line went dead. I sat in the darkness, the phone feeling like a talisman in my hand. The ghost network was stirring. The pieces were beginning to move on a chessboard my son and his wife didn't even know existed. Hope was a dangerous thing, but for the first time in a long time, I felt its warmth spreading through my veins. 2 days later, my lawyer, Sarah Klein, requested an urgent meeting. The last time I had seen her, she had been world-weary and pessimistic. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of an overwhelming caseload. She had advised me to accept whatever deal Ethan and Chloe offered, to avoid a humiliating public battle I would surely lose. The woman who walked into the small, sterile meeting room at the public defender's office was a different person entirely. Her eyes were wide, not with exhaustion, but with a mixture of terror and awe. She carried her worn leather briefcase like a shield. She sat down opposite me, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the table. She just stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing me for the first time. "Mrs. Sterling," she began, her voice a near whisper. She swallowed hard. "Mia." I simply waited, my face a placid mask of grandmotherly concern. I received a call yesterday," she stammered. "From Judge Arthur Vance. Retired. Federal Judge Arthur Vance. He said he was an old family friend. He invited me for coffee." "That was kind of him," I said softly. Sarah let out a short, hysterical laugh. "Kind? Mrs. Sterling, we talked for 2 hours. He didn't talk about the law. He told me stories, vague stories. About loyalty and debts and people who operate in the shadows. He talked about a woman named Cassandra, who could see the future and was never believed. He told me that some cases are not what they seem, and that a lawyer's highest duty is to protect those who have spent their lives protecting others. He looked at me, Mrs. Sterling, and he said, 'Some clients are more than just a case file. They are a national treasure. Treat her as such.'" She leaned forward, her eyes boring into mine. "Who are you?" she breathed. I gave her a small, sad smile. "I'm a widow whose son is trying to steal her house." The answer seemed to satisfy and terrify her in equal measure. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was firm, resolute. The jaded public defender was gone. In her place was a warrior. "Okay," she said, nodding to herself. "Okay, I work for you, Mia, only for you. From this moment on, we fight. Forget settling. We go for scorched earth. They have presented a power of attorney document signed by your husband, giving Ethan full control. They claim it was signed a month before he passed. They have videos, they have a narrative. What do we have?" The time for games was over. This was my new field commander. "The POA is a forgery," I said, my voice clear and steady, all trace of the frail old woman gone. "Chloe forged my husband's signature. I saw her practicing it for weeks. Can you prove it?" "Not his signature. She's a talented artist. But we can prove the timing. The document itself is a lie. The original POA, the one Richard actually signed years ago, named me as the sole agent. That document was created digitally and stored in his private cloud account. If we can get that original file... The metadata, Sarah breathed, her eyes lighting up. The digital timestamp. It would prove the original existed long before their fake one. It would prove their document was created fraudulently. It would blow their entire case out of the water. Exactly, I said. But the account is protected. Two-factor authentication linked to Ethan's cell phone. Sarah's face fell. Then we can't get in. We'd need a court order, and a judge won't grant one based on the word of someone they're trying to declare incompetent. I leaned forward. We don't need a court order. We need a key, and I have one. My grandson, Leo. This was the most delicate part of the operation. Involving Leo was a risk, but a necessary one. He was my only ally on the inside, my eyes and ears. Now I needed him to be my hands. That evening, when he brought my tray down, his face etched with worry, I made my move. Leo, I whispered, taking the tray from him. I need you to be brave. Braver than you've ever been. He looked at me, his young eyes serious. They're bad people, Grandma. They're liars. Yes, they are, and we are going to prove it. But I need your help. It's a secret mission, just for us. Can you handle that? He puffed out his small chest. I'm a soldier. You said so. My heart ached with love and regret. I was pulling this innocent child into my dark world. But it was the only way to save us both. I need you to make a phone call for me. You will have to pretend to be your father. I spent the next hour coaching him, walking him through the script I had prepared in my head. It was a classic social engineering gambit. Simple, elegant, and devastatingly effective if done correctly. We rehearsed it over and over in hushed whispers, there in the gloom of the basement. I taught him how to inject a note of panic into his voice, how to sound stressed and rushed, just like Ethan always did when he wasn't getting his way. The next day, the moment came. Chloe was out shopping for a new laptop, her credit card still smoking. Ethan was locked in his home office, on a loud, angry conference call. It was the perfect window. Leo slipped down to the basement, his face pale but determined, his own cell phone in his hand. Sarah was on standby, ready on her end. I knelt beside him, my hand on his shoulder. You're ready, soldier. Just like we practiced. I'm right here with you. He took a deep, shaky breath and dialed the customer service number for the phone company. I put my ear close to the phone, listening. Thank you for calling Omnitel. My name is Brenda. How can I help you? A cheerful voice chirped. Leo's voice, a perfect imitation of his father's frantic tone, came out. Yeah, hi, I need some help. This is an emergency. My name is Ethan Sterling. My phone was just stolen. Right out of my hand. Oh my, sir. I'm so sorry to hear that. Let me pull up your account. I held my breath. This was the first hurdle. Okay, Mr. Sterling, I have your account here. To make any changes, I just need to verify your mother's maiden name. My blood ran cold. It was a security question I hadn't anticipated, but Leo, my brilliant boy, didn't hesitate. He knew. It's Croft, he said, the name sounding like a curse. My maiden name. The name of the woman Ethan was trying to erase. Thank you for verifying, Brenda said, oblivious. Now, what can I do for you? Look, I'm trying to lock all my credit cards, my bank accounts, everything, Leo said, his voice rising with practiced panic. But everything uses two-factor authentication, and the codes are going to the stolen phone. I'm completely locked out. I need you to temporarily reroute my authentication text to a different number. Just for an hour or so, until I can get to a store and get a new phone. I can certainly do that, sir. What is the number you'd like to use? Leo read out Sarah's number, the one we had memorized. Okay, Mr. Sterling. I've temporarily rerouted all SMS messages to that number for the next 60 minutes. Please get a new device as soon as possible. Thank you, Leo cried and hung up. He looked at me, his eyes wide. Did I do it? You were perfect, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I hugged him tightly. Absolutely perfect. Seconds later, my burner phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. Code received. I'm in. The exhale I let out felt like it emptied my lungs of a decade of grief. We were in. Sarah, guided by my instructions, navigated the labyrinth of Richard's digital life. It was all there, perfectly organized: business files, personal correspondence, and a folder cryptically labeled Estate. Another text from Sarah. Found it. It's a PDF. File name, POA master.pdf. My heart hammered against my ribs. Check the metadata, I texted back, my fingers flying. Creation date. A minute passed. It felt like an eternity. Then, the reply came, the words glowing on the screen, a beacon of light in the darkness of the basement. MIA. I've got it. Creation. Date, October 17th, 2011. Years before Richard's death, years before Chloe had even dreamed of her pathetic little forgery. Downloading now, Sarah's next text read. We have the key. We have it all. The storm is coming, Mia, and we are going to be the lightning. I deleted the text and powered down the burner phone. I looked at Leo, who was watching me with a hopeful smile. I smiled back, a real smile, the first one in years. The foundation of their lies had just been shattered. They had built their house of cards on my supposed weakness, my supposed dementia. They never imagined I would be the one to kick the table out from under them. The gathering storm was over. The hurricane was about to make landfall, right in the middle of a courtroom, and I was ready. The air in the courtroom was a stale mixture of old paper, cheap polish, and the cloying scent of Chloe's perfume. It felt heavy, oppressive, designed to crush the spirit. I sat hunched in my chair, my hands clasped in my lap, making them tremble ever so slightly. A performance. Every part of this was a performance. Across the room, Ethan and Chloe sat beside their lawyer, a man named Davies, whose suit was as slick as his smile. They were the very picture of concerned, responsible children burdened by a senile parent. Chloe would occasionally dab at a dry eye with a tissue, a perfect little gesture for the judge. Ethan simply looked grave, his brow furrowed in a mask of solemn duty. They were smug. It radiated from them, a shimmering heat of anticipated victory. They thought this was the final act, the tidy legal knot that would secure them my house, my money, and the freedom to discard me completely. I let my gaze drift, unfocused, around the room, playing the part of a woman lost in the fog of her own mind. But I saw everything: the stern, tired face of Judge Miller, the bored expression of the court reporter, the way Sarah, my own court-appointed lawyer, sat perfectly still, her files arranged in a neat, unassuming stack before her. After my talk with her, orchestrated by Silas, Sarah was no longer the timid public defender advising a plea. She was a weapon waiting to be fired. Mr. Davies stood, his voice a smooth, condescending baritone that filled the space. Your Honor, we are here today for a simple, if unfortunate, reason. My clients, Mr. Ethan Sterling and his wife, Mrs. Chloe Sterling, are seeking conservatorship over Mr. Sterling's mother, Mia Sterling. He gestured toward me with a sad, pitying sweep of his hand. I flinched, as if startled by the sound of my own name. This is not a step they take lightly. It is born of love, of deep and abiding concern for a woman who is, tragically, no longer able to care for herself or her affairs. He droned on, painting a picture of my decline. He spoke of my confusion, my memory lapses, my increasing isolation. He used words like vulnerable and incapacitated. He made me sound like a fragile ghost, a flickering light about to be extinguished. Ethan and Chloe nodded along, their faces masks of pained agreement. I felt a cold, clean anger rise within me, but I pushed it down, burying it deep beneath the facade of a frail old woman. Patience. It was the first and last lesson of my profession. To that end, Your Honor, Davies continued, reaching into his briefcase with a dramatic flourish, we would like to present Exhibit A, a durable power of attorney, signed by Mrs. Sterling's late husband, the esteemed Richard Sterling, shortly before his passing. He held up the document as if it were a sacred text. This document grants his son Ethan full authority over the estate in the event of his death or his wife's incapacitation. Richard Sterling was a man of foresight. He knew his wife's health was precarious. He wanted to ensure she would be protected, that her affairs would be managed by the person he trusted most in the world, his own son. He laid the document on the clerk's desk. It was a good forgery. Chloe had practiced Richard's signature for weeks. I knew because Leo had told me, describing how he'd found scraps of paper filled with her attempts in the trash. Davies looked at me, his eyes full of false sympathy. It is with a heavy heart that my clients seek to enact this provision. They only want what's best for Mia. They want to honor Richard's last wishes. He returned to his seat, looking satisfied. The air in the room thickened with the weight of his lie. The judge peered down at the document over her glasses. For a moment, a terrible, fleeting moment, I felt a tremor of real fear. What if this didn't work? What if Silas's contact hadn't been enough? Then Sarah stood up. She didn't move with the theatricality of Davies. She rose with a quiet, solid deliberation that commanded attention. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm and clear. "Mr. Davies is correct. The late Richard Sterling was indeed a man of foresight, so much so that he kept meticulous digital copies of all his important documents in a secure cloud account." Chloe's perfectly composed face twitched, just a flicker of a muscle near her eye. Ethan's hand, resting on the table, curled into a fist. "And while we appreciate Mr. Davies presenting his version of the power of attorney," Sarah continued, "we would like to present the original document, retrieved directly from Mr. Sterling's own encrypted cloud server this morning, with the full cooperation of his estate's digital executor." Sarah nodded to the clerk, who took a file from her. The image of a document flashed onto the large screens, positioned for the court to see. It looked identical to the one Davies had presented. I could feel Chloe's breath hitch from across the room. She thought, for a split second, that it was a pointless move. "If you would direct your attention to the metadata, Your Honor," Sarah said, and a section of the screen was magnified, a string of dates and code. "The document Mr. Davies has presented as Exhibit A," she said, her voice dropping a notch, becoming harder, sharper, "was created and digitally signed on March 17th. According to the coroner's report, which is a matter of public record, Richard Sterling had been deceased for 2 full weeks by that date." Silence. A profound, echoing silence that consumed the entire courtroom. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Davies's smug smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. He stared at the screen, then at his own copy of the document, then back at the screen. Chloe's face had gone from a healthy, sun-kissed tan to a pasty, sickly white. Ethan stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek. He looked like a man who had just seen the ground open up beneath his feet. The judge slowly took off her glasses, polishing them with a cloth as she stared at Chloe and Ethan. She didn't need to say a word. Her expression was pure, unadulterated granite. The forgery wasn't just a lie, it was a clumsy, arrogant one, an insult to the court's intelligence. Before anyone could recover, before Davies could stammer out an objection, Sarah spoke again, her voice cutting through the stunned quiet. "Furthermore, Your Honor, regarding my client's alleged mental state and the loving concern of her son and daughter-in-law," she placed a small digital audio player on the desk. "We have several audio recordings provided by a source within the home who was deeply concerned for Mrs. von Sterling's welfare. This first recording is from the evening of March 24th, captured in the kitchen of the Sterling residence." Sarah pressed a button. A hiss of static, and then Chloe's voice filled the courtroom. It was crystal clear, sharp and nasal, stripped of the sweet, caring tone she used in public. It was the voice I heard every day. "Just need another week. Her doctor is a complete idiot. He'll sign off on anything. We just need to get the old cow officially declared crazy. Then we sell the house and we are gone. I can't stand looking at her pathetic, confused face for another minute." A clink of a wine glass followed. Then, the recording continued. Ethan's voice, deeper, but just as cold, just as damning. "The POA is the key. Once that's filed, it's over. She'll sign anything if I tell her Dad wanted it. She still thinks he was a saint." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was heavier than before. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of judgment. I watched the color drain completely from Ethan's face. This was a blow he hadn't anticipated. He had never imagined that his own son, Leo, his quiet, sullen boy, would become the instrument of his downfall. The judge stared at Ethan and Chloe, her face a mask of cold fury. The court reporter's fingers, which had been flying across her keyboard, were now still. She was just staring, her mouth slightly agape. The illusion was shattered. The loving family was a fiction. In its place stood two greedy, cruel conspirators, their own words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Chloe finally broke. She couldn't contain the rage, the humiliation. It erupted out of her in a raw, ugly screech. She lunged to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. Her face was a grotesque mask of purple fury, her manicured finger pointing directly at me. "You!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You ungrateful, senile witch! After everything we've done for you. Letting you live in our house, that money, it's ours. Richard left it to us. It's our inheritance." Her lawyer grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back down, whispering frantic, useless words. But Chloe was beyond reason. She was a cornered animal, lashing out. Ethan didn't move. He just sat there, a statue of a man, his empire of lies crumbling around him. And then, I moved. Slowly, deliberately. I stood up. I felt every eye in the room shift to me. I took a deep breath and let it out, and with it, I shed the last 60 years of my life. I pushed my shoulders back. My spine, which had been curled into the shape of a question mark for months, straightened. The hunch was gone. The tremor in my hands ceased. I lifted my chin, and the vacant, confused look in my eyes sharpened into a focused, icy point. The frail, doddering old woman who had entered the courtroom vanished. In her place stood someone they had never met, someone they should have been afraid of. And my voice, when I spoke, did not tremble. It was not the thin, reedy whisper they were used to. It was low, clear, and carried across the silent room with an authority that had been dormant for decades. "The house," I said, looking not at Chloe, but at the judge, "was never Richard's to give." Chloe's tirade stopped mid-syllable. My gaze shifted to her. "It is a non-attributable agency asset. It was assigned to me in 1988 as part of my relocation package following the conclusion of the Vienna operation." I saw a flicker of utter confusion in her eyes. Agency? Operation? The words were meaningless to her. She looked at Ethan for help, but he was ashen, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening understanding. He knew enough of his father's world to know that I was not speaking nonsense. I let the silence hang for a moment before continuing, my tone as cold and precise as a scalpel. "The money you are so desperate to get your hands on is not an inheritance. It's a pension. My pension, paid from a black budget for a life's work you are utterly incapable of imagining." I took a step forward, away from the defendant's table, standing free in the open space. I felt a sense of liberation that was dizzying. For 35 years I served. While you were planning parties and complaining about the caterers, Chloe, I was in places that don't appear on maps, doing things that are never spoken of. Richard was my handler before he was my husband, a fact he conveniently omitted from the stories he told his son. My eyes locked with Ethan's. His face was a canvas of disbelief and horror. The whole narrative of his life, his powerful, important father, his weak, dependent mother, was being systematically dismantled in front of a captive audience. "Your father," I said, my voice dropping even lower, becoming almost conversational, "left nothing of value. Nothing but a name he'd tarnished with his greed and incompetence in his final years." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. I could see the gears turning in his head, the terror starting to bloom. "In fact," I added, delivering the final, fatal blow, "he left a significant debt, a very, very large one, owed to some very, very unpleasant people who do not care about due process and are not known for their patience." The memory of the SVR file, of Richard's treachery, was a cold stone in my gut. A debt which, According to the document you so helpfully forged and submitted to this court, I gestured to the forged POA still displayed on the screen, is now legally, unequivocally, yours. I looked at my son, the boy I had once loved, now a man hollowed out by greed. There was no triumph in my heart, only a vast, cold emptiness. He had made his choice. He had chosen the ghost of his father over the mother who was sitting right in front of him. "Congratulations, Ethan," I said, and my voice was devoid of all emotion. "You finally inherited something from your father." The judge's gavel fell not with a bang, but with a quiet thud that barely registered over the sterile hum of the courtroom's air conditioning. The dismissal of Ethan's petition was a formality. The subsequent filing of charges against him and Chloe, forgery, elder abuse, conspiracy, was just paperwork, a series of ink strokes on official letterhead. There was no surge of triumph, no thirst for retribution quenched. It was simply the closing of a file, the end of a procedure. The law had done its part, but I knew the law was a blunt instrument. It could punish, but it couldn't deliver justice in the language that people like my son and his wife understood. Their real education was yet to begin. I didn't return to the house. There was nothing for me there but the ghost of a life I'd funded, and the lingering chill of their cruelty. I left it standing, a monument to their greed, filled with furniture they couldn't afford and memories they now wished they could burn. Silas's people had handled the transfer, signing the deed back over to a holding company with a name so bland it was practically invisible. The house was no longer mine. It had never really been theirs. It was just a stage, and the play was over. From the quiet anonymity of a downtown hotel room, I watched the first act of their new life unfold, not with my own eyes, but through the sparse, clinical reports from Silas. A week after the court proceedings, their world, which had seemed so solid and secure, began to crack. It started with a knock on the door, not the timid rap of a delivery person or the cheerful chime of a neighbor. It was a firm, resonant knock, the kind that waits. I can picture it so clearly. Ethan, still puffed up with a self-righteous indignation that the world had dared to cross him, would have swung the door open, a complaint already forming on his lips. Chloe would have been hovering behind him, her face a mask of practiced victimhood, and on the doorstep would be two men. They wouldn't look like thugs from a cheap movie. They would be dressed in dark, impeccably tailored suits that cost more than Ethan's car. Their faces would be placid, their eyes holding a stillness that was far more terrifying than any open threat. "Ethan Sterling?" one of them would ask, his voice calm, polite, devoid of any accent or emotion. "Who's asking?" Ethan would reply, his bravado already beginning to fray at the edges. The man wouldn't answer the question. He would simply state his purpose. "We are here to collect an asset belonging to our associates. We were told Richard Sterling was in possession of a ledger. We would like it back." The ledger. The word would hang in the air between them. I can see the confusion on Ethan's face turning to dawning horror. He and Chloe had only ever seen the money, the illusion of wealth. They never understood the source, the real currency Richard had dealt in. They thought his legacy was a portfolio of stocks and a fat bank account. They had no idea his true legacy was a web of obligations to very dangerous people. I don't know what you're talking about," Ethan would stammer, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. Chloe, behind him, would have gone pale, her hand flying to her throat. This wasn't a problem she could solve with a condescending remark or a strategically filmed video. The second man, who hadn't spoken a word, would have then smiled, a thin, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That is an unfortunate answer," he'd say softly. "Our associates are not patient. The ledger details certain transactions. Its value is considerable. As Richard's legal heir, that debt now falls to you. We will be in touch to arrange a payment schedule." They wouldn't have pushed their way in. They wouldn't have raised their voices. They would have simply turned and walked away, leaving Ethan and Chloe standing in the doorway with the cold weight of a truth they could no longer ignore. They had fought so viciously to be Richard's heirs. I had made sure the court legally recognized their fraudulent power of attorney just long enough for the title to pass, and with it, all of his debts. "Congratulations, son. You've inherited the wind." The reports from Silas became a chronicle of their frantic unraveling. The for sale sign went up in the yard first. Then came the online listings for Chloe's jewelry, for Ethan's collection of expensive watches, for the designer furniture they'd paraded in front of their friends. They were liquidating their life, not to pay lawyers, but to appease shadows who didn't negotiate. Their friends, the ones who had clinked glasses at their parties and pitied them for the burden of an elderly mother, melted away. Calls went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. The fear was a tangible thing, a third resident in that big, empty house. The last I heard, they were seen arguing in a used car lot, their faces pinched and gray. They were constantly looking over their shoulders, forever listening for a knock on the door. They were no longer hunters, they were the hunted, and I felt nothing but a profound, quiet stillness. My war was over. While their world was shrinking into a cage of their own making, ours was just beginning to open up. The crisp, recycled air of the Portland International Airport hummed with possibility. Light streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, liberated souls. For the first time in years, I felt the sun on my face, not as a fleeting warmth through a grimy basement window, but as a promise. I stood with Leo, watching the planes take off and land, each one a silver vessel carrying hundreds of stories away to new chapters. He had chosen me, without hesitation. The day after the hearing, he had packed a single bag, walked out of that house, and never looked back. He was 16, with the quiet solemnity of an old soul, his eyes holding a fierce loyalty that humbled me. He had been my silent soldier, my witness, and now he was my future. I had already made the arrangements. The house, the money, the entire infrastructure of my old life was gone, folded back into the agency's vast, invisible holdings. I was a ghost again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the cold, calculated erasure of an operative going dark. It was a shedding of skin, a release. I was no one, which meant I could finally be myself. Leo looked down at the tickets in his hand, his brow furrowed in a gentle confusion that was so unlike his father's angry entitlement. He traced the letters of the destination with his finger. "Prague?" he asked, his voice soft amidst the terminal's announcements. "Why Prague?" I turned to look at him, and a real smile spread across my face. Not the pained, weary smile of the old woman in the basement, or the thin, strategic smile of the operative. It was just a smile. It felt new. "Your grandfather always hated it there," I said, my voice light. "He said it was too sentimental, too full of winding streets that led nowhere. He preferred straight lines, direct roads, no surprises." Leo looked up from the tickets, a slow understanding dawning in his eyes. He saw the beautiful, quiet defiance in the choice. It wasn't an act of vengeance against Richard's memory. It was an act of pure self-definition. We were going to a place not because of what it was, but because of what it wasn't, a part of Richard's world. He smiled back, a wide, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. "I think I'll like it then." "I think we'll start there," I said, my gaze drifting back to the runway, to a plane lifting gracefully into the vast blue sky. Freedom, I realized, wasn't just about escaping the cage. It was about having the strength to walk away from the battlefield altogether. It was about choosing your own destination, drawing your own map. It was about finally living the life they told you that you couldn't, one winding, beautiful street at a time.